Hello and welcome to episode 129 of Retro Power Uncut. And we're going to introduce a new project today. It's one that I suspect will cause a bit of a stir, perhaps. It's one we've had on the cards for quite a while. I'd say it was booked in, because we're booking a fair way out, so it was probably booked in 2.5 years ago at least. And those who follow our social media will probably have seen on Instagram that we dropped some renderings of how this project might look, also quite some time ago. I might have reposted them a couple of times since. It's a project we're extremely excited about. I suspect there will immediately be, Johnny Smith will come up in conversation, shall we say, and there's actually an interesting link. We talked to Johnny a fair bit, and he actually approached us. I reckon it was maybe 6. I feel like it was 6 or 7 years ago.
7 years ago.
I think we only just had the workshop in there, and that was 2013. So I'm guessing it might have been 2014. He actually approached us about doing the Allegro that you may be aware of that he's now doing with, I think, is it Matt? Oh, this is embarrassing, I should know his name. Matt, the guy at Fabco anyway. Apologies if it's not Matt, but I think it is. And that's actually progressing pretty well now. It looks quite a cool project. So I'm hoping that maybe at some point during the course of this build, we might get to do a bit of a joint video, maybe more than one, who knows, watch this space on that. But yeah, certainly our project is perhaps hinting back to what I feel BL might have been trying to achieve in terms of a hot hatch, is it fair to say?
Yeah, I was to say that back in the late 70s, sort of apex of British Leyland disorganisation, I suppose, there was an interesting bit of slightly odd history. A lot of people will be aware of the fact that there was a big collaboration between Austin, BL, Rover later on, and Honda. But that actually started quite a bit earlier than a lot of people might be aware. And in, I think it was 1978, Honda actually approached British Leyland about a joint venture because they wanted to increase their presence in Europe without just sort of taking market share themselves. They wanted to do a joint venture. They approached British Leyland about that. And BL, I don't know what they thought of that idea at the time, but certainly it was right at the time that they were really struggling to sell Allegros. And the competition was picking up, Mark 1 Golf had been launched, the Mark 1 Fiesta was around then as well. There was some really stiff competition. They were losing market share really quickly, and Honda came knocking on the door at what was probably just about the right time, because these were not well-built cars. They was really suffering with these, really suffering with Maxis, really suffering with Marinas. It was just a carnage in the British Leyland range at the time. And Honda came in and said, let's do a joint venture, and with a bit of to-ing and fro-ing, they ended up bringing the Honda Ballade over, and I think as a bit of a throwaway, British Leyland said, well, we've finished with the Triumph brand, as a bit of a test in the water, and just in case it all goes wrong, we'll just tack a Triumph name on it, call it the Triumph Acclaim, and that pretty much, I wouldn't say it saved the business, that would be an exaggeration, but it really helped preserve their bit of a niche of their business that was really should have been being held by the Allegro until the Maestro came along. So actually, the kind of successor, if you like, and the car that kind of filled the gap that the Allegro was struggling to fill was actually Honda powered, and chiefly a Honda. Back in, the development was done in 1979, I think it was launched in 81, something like that. But effectively, you could say that this car's successor really was a Honda.
It's a shame, really, that Honda weren't involved with the drivetrain of these, because that's I'm going to get shot down for this, but I actually think the shape of this thing is fundamentally a pretty nice shape. And what doesn't perhaps strike you until you have one in front of you in person, it's a really small car. It really is like a little hot hatch. It's just that, and by the end of it, they did was it the Keep or Equip or whatever, which was obviously visually had sporting, ideas. But the powertrain never really supported that.
I think engine, or whatever. I think it was an O series.
It kind of feels like if they had a decent power plant, it could have genuinely have made quite a decent hot hatch. And that's basically what we're trying to do with it, is come up with a way of making this executing it to a much higher standard than the budgets would have allowed back in the day. B, make it a really, really exciting thing to drive, and C, make it something really awesome to look at, which is a fairly tall order when you look at what we're starting with here. But in terms of the front-wheel drive, hot hatch drivetrain, that kind of leads us on to what's behind it, doesn't it?
Where currently being dismantled, we've got a DC2 Honda Integra. We, well, Cal found, I think, in conjunction with a chap we know, found a good history, but a bit poorly, DC2 Integra, suffering a bit of rust, sort of at that point in its life where it needed quite a lot of help. And it's now being the proud donor of quite a substantial part of itself to the Allegro project. And the current plan is that the entire underpinnings of the Integra are going into the Allegro silhouette, a modified Allegro silhouette. But the full underpinnings and floor pan is all being transferred into the Allegro shell, outer shell that is, so that we basically replicate all of the Honda driving experience as far as is possible, but in the Allegro body.
It's actually remarkable. We did some scan work on this a while ago just to see if this ridiculous idea might work, and we did a 3D scan of kind of all of the engine bay, bulkhead, a lot of critical dimensions of the Integra, and likewise of the Allegro, and some of it made a remarkable amount of sense. I don't want to speculate too far until we've got the two shells sort of over each other, but certainly all the inner wing structure, engine, bulkhead, all sits in a remarkably good place versus the screen and front end of the Allegro. And I guess the thinking, the thought process that led to this was, if we want to make it a front-wheel drive hot hatch, we want geometry that gives that driving experience and a powertrain that gives that driving experience. What is a fantastic front-wheel drive hot hatch? The DC2 Integra Type R is definitely up there. Most car guys will probably have it in their top 5 front-wheel drives at least. And dimensionally it made the most sense. So although I suspect we are going to get some flack for this decision, we are proceeding with our plan of using part of the body shell, certainly in terms of how all the subframe mounts, where the bulkhead is, etc., of a DC2 Integra, the power plant, which is absolutely awesome bit of kit. I mean, that's my sort of early memories of Honda VTEC stuff is the 1600 in the CRX, which was just mind-blowing at the time because it made nearly 100 horsepower per litre from a 1.6, 160-ish horsepower. And then it was kind of, that B-Series engine kind of built up to this being the definitive B-Series. And although the K-Series has come along since, which is also an awesome engine, this is a little bit more compact. And to me, it's just the definitive Honda VTEC. Another thing, and this sounds really strange to say, it's a much more attractive looking engine.
It's far more presentable, it just looks cleaner. And you know, 9,000 RPM in factory, you know, straight out of the box, from a factory engine, 200 horsepower, or nearly, give or take, 200 horsepower, 800cc. And it's super lightweight. Just a really nice engine package. And it's very compact as well. It's really super compact, so it gives us a chance to actually get it under the Allegro bonnet. Again, we've got a little bit of work. We're coming in quite early here. We've not trodden all the ground yet, but certainly the scan work shows we've got bonnet clearance and enough bonnet clearance to raise the axle centre lines within the Allegro body shell outer silhouette. And still have good suspension, basically still keep all of the suspension travel of the Integra, keep all of the good bits of the Integra as Honda intended it, but make it look exactly correct in the Allegro body shell.
Yeah. So can we pull it off? An Allegro that looks awesome, is built to a high standard, and an awesome driving machine. We're at that point where we're setting ourselves quite a big challenge publicly on the internet, which we might regret, but you'll have to watch this space and see how the project evolves.
See the journey develop.
How much of the hair tearing out bit will we put in? Anyway, I'm going to hand over to Nat for the rest of the metal workshop, and we'll pick back up with me in the assembly shop in a few minutes. Ooh.
Well, moving on from all that excitement, we'll dare I say it, back to Mark 1 Escort. I'm sounding a bit like a cracked record now, I know, but we are on the second one, Project Kuma, which, was it down here last week? I can't remember now. Was it still on the jig last week? I lose track. Anyway, Project Kuma, the second Mark 1 Escort build, which had leapt ahead quite a long way. It caught up the first build, as you'll remember, by quite a margin. Sam's working on this, getting on top of all of the sort of minor jobs. Obviously, the major serious large-scale fabrication's done. He's working on, in fact, he's pretty much just finished it. I've actually just asked him to stop because he was having to hammer things and it was going to sound a bit loud in the background on video. But he's just on the latter stages, looking at it, of TIG welding in the gearbox tunnel top, which is pretty much there. he has fabricated the sections for the gearbox cross member underneath. I think he just started that last week, possibly. There's a couple of little hitches. There's actually a couple of dimensional differences between the chassis rails on this shell and the other shell, only very slight, about 4mm I think, but it was enough that the gaps, the way the pieces, the fabricated sections actually slot in between the rails and then spot weld in place and stitch weld in place. There was gaps that we didn't really want, so he's actually modified the drawing slightly and refabricated the parts just so it's a perfect fit into the rails. Bit of bulkhead modification for the air filter. Again, there's a slight difference on the bulkheads in that we had to trim this one just slightly more to get the same air filter clearance as on the other one. Again, you were talking within 5mm, but it's just one of those things where you realise there is a bit of variation car to car. And then he's been putting in the sections that Bobby made for the first car, for Project 1. He's been working on getting those into the inner wings for the Nitron front strut remote reservoir mounts that bolt through the inner wing. They have like a billet piece on top with a seal round to stop water coming up into the engine bay so that you can access the adjusters from in the engine bay. But he's got that all done and fitted the clamps, fitted the captive nuts for the clamps, and got the little towers welded into the inner wings so that the remote reservoirs go through. And I'm just trying to think what else. There's a few other little jobs he's been doing. Basically, just all the finishing off bits around the front that need to be done before the front panel and the front end goes on, while it's all easily accessible. As I say, he's just ploughing on with that. There's not too long. We'll see. I'm not going to commit to a time scale. I always get it miles wrong. But the finish line is in sight on that. Moving on from that, I'm actually going to skip past Churchill just for a sec and kind of jump around a bit just to keep Jamie on his toes. But also on Project Kuma, the second Mark 1 Escort, Tom's working here. I think Tom's possibly gone home actually. Yeah, I think he may have finished now. But oh no, he's not. I know what Tom's doing. He's over there TIG welding, and he's making another hand guard because this job using this dead blow hammer. If you miss and hit your hand, especially if you do it several times, you turn your hand into a well tenderised steak, and that's pretty much where Tom's got to. He's pretty accurate with a hammer, but while you're keeping your eye on these clamps and not hitting your hammering hand into the clamps, it's very easy to miss on the other end of the job. Anyway, all of that aside, Tom's working on the wheel arches for the second car. Because this set are being made here, you can actually see the progress sort of on camera as it develops. This is half of a wheel arch being formed over this epoxy tooling former. We've mentioned this before, hammer forming former, which was CNC machined to the CAD drawings that George did for the final wheel arch design. So this starts as a flat piece of flat blank. Wait there, Jamie, I'll bring a flat blank over to show you. So that starts as that piece of 20 gauge steel, flat piece cut out to an approximate pattern. So that's cut out. And then that is then basically progressively clamped by these sheets of MDF and a multitude of clamps to hold it at sort of this height level. And then that is gradually chased down using a variety of nylon chasers cut out from nylon sheet, one of which Tom's got over there. But basically that is chased down over this former. And then once it's chased down to the first piece of MDF, then that's removed, and it's chased down to the next piece of MDF, that's removed, chased down to the next, and so on until that's chased all the way down. And while that happens, obviously you develop these tucks in the material, these big, these waves in the material of the spare material, because as it goes down, it effectively needs to shrink. So then what the really skilled part of the job is then chasing those tucks using your hammer and chaser into a tuck that's contained by being chased in and crimped effectively around the edge with the chaser, so it can't expand, using the clamps to your advantage to prevent that expanding, and then flattening that material onto itself, which actually thickens it. Now some of these tucks, you'll probably be gaining 0.2, maybe 0.3 of a mil in thickness of the material by the time you flatten those out. So there's a lot of material to shift and a lot of force required, hence the number of clamps involved. And to that end, we've been making a little clamping rig this morning for the next one, just so we've got a bit better control of things. But yeah, that's what Tom's been working on, is making the wheel arch halves for the Kuma Escort, and that's what he's going to be doing for a little while now. There's probably another couple of weeks, maybe 3 weeks of work in making these wheel arches. It's quite a long job. One of these halves is between 1 and 2 days, probably, certainly a day's work. If it goes really well, everything's perfect and everything's bang on, probably done in a day. realistically it could stretch into 2. So, you know, there's a fair few hours work involved in getting these made. And that's getting them made. Then they've got to be trimmed, welded in the middle. Once they're welded in the middle, then they've got to be retrimmed to the car, scribe the car out, cut the car, fit them, TIG weld them in, blanish them. A lot of work, but all to a pretty good end, with a pretty good end result, which we can show you in a minute. However, before we do that, we'll quickly touch on the Churchill Jag. Lots of not particularly photogenic jobs going on this, again. Where we're doing all the little nitty-gritty bits. We talked about the radiator, air conditioning condenser, fan area last week. That's been revisited and gone around the mill a little bit more. We now have a fan that fits, and Stu's made up the mounts onto the dummy radiator for that fan. It's a Spell fan. We use Spell for all our electric fans. They make a really good range, really good quality, and really shift a lot of air. And they actually give you the CFM ratings of the fans, which gives you a pretty, the cubic feet a minute of air that fan will move. And I assume they do actually do what they say. Certainly, we've never had any problems with the quantity of air shifted by their fans, whereas some of the other slightly less some of the no-name ones tend to not have the performance you'd expect. So anyway, we've got that in place. It fits just. I think Carl had been hoping to get a slightly bigger fan in there. We're pretty happy that will be big enough, but the constraints are quite tricky in terms of space in front of these. I've said it loads of times before, so I'm not going to harp on about that again. However, yeah, the fan's in place on the back of the dummy radiator. The front side of the dummy radiator is done. Stu's now made the upper and lower mounts and fitted them to the dummy rad, so that then when that goes off for fabrication in aluminium, the mounts will be made exactly the same, so everything will fit exactly as it does now. So he's made the mounts for that. And then between Stu and Cal, they've resolved the air conditioning condenser issue. I think they're now using like an aftermarket 1937 Ford type condenser. One's designed for hot rods, where they have, again, quite a narrow vertical grill opening. And I think on those, the inlet and outlet points vertically up and down, which means that we can actually get them in the space. It's just a lot easier to get the plumbing in the space available. So I think they've resolved that issue. I think we've got one of those condensers now on its way to us, so that Stu can get all that mocked up in the front and make all that fit. And he's been doing a few other bits. I noticed he'd been doing a little trial fit to make sure we can actually get because we changed the structure in the parcel shelf area, he'd been doing a little trial fit to make sure we could actually get the wiring to and from the rear heated screen, because the way the structure changed, there's not any apertures where that wiring originally went. So he's just been sorting that out, making sure he's got clearance and he can actually get the wires in and out. You can physically feed them through and back. And then he's also done a little job on the doors, making sure that we can fit, well, not making sure, putting provision in for the door lock and release plungers in the doors, because the Jaguar locking mechanisms that we're using have those plungers, and that provision wasn't in the doors as they were for those, so he's added the provision in. And that's pretty much where we're at on Churchill. It's progress, but it's all little bits that aren't that visual. Sorry, there's another bit. I missed a bit. It's not very visual because it's not here. George has been very busy. Again, we mentioned it last week that he'd started the CAD work on this. He'd finished the scanning work. He'd started the CAD work on it. He's now waiting for me, basically, long and short of it. He's done most of the CAD work now. He's drawn up the cross member, which looks really good. He's got the main mounting tubes for the lower wishbones inserted into it. That's all good. Got the reinforcements for those. He's built the towers in CAD, which are all fabricated in, I think he's drawn them at 6mm steel plate. We might back that off to 4mm here and there, but it's a pretty stout item because all the spring load's going to be going through it as well. So he's drawn that. He's drawn the towers all as a fabricated sheet metal item. With the coilover mounts in, because we're going to put it on 2 coilover front suspension, just purely, people I think it's some sort of sports and performance idea. It's not, it's just an easy way of containing a spring within a damper without having to mount them separately. Just makes the mounting easier. So we'll use a coilover damper unit on the front, an upside down mounted coilover spring and damper unit on the front, and he's also now drawn up the modified upper wishbones. We're using, again, people who have seen this before probably, we're using loosely a Jaguar X300/XJ40 front suspension setup, but picking and choosing the components. So we're using the uprights, hubs, brakes, ball joints, all the complete outer assemblies from X300, using X300, XJ40, whatever you want to call it, lower wishbones, and we're using a very slightly modified upper XJ40, X300 wishbone, which we'll be making those. They'll be machined from billet, but they're going to be, I think, 15 mil shorter than the standard one, which gives us, basically, it kills two birds with one stone. It gives us clearance on the inner wing, which we don't have with a standard X300 wishbone, but it also means that we get a bit of camber gain. I think I talked about that previously, but we've now confirmed the modification. It's 15 mil shorter, which gives us just a nice bit of camber gain. It's actually it works all round. It's all win, no lose on that, so that's good. And he's modified the shape of that upper arm slightly as well, so that we can get the coilover through it without it fouling that. So that's all looking really good, but he's now waiting for me to draw to basically pinpoint exactly where I want the steering rack. So I need to go away and do some head scratching and some CAD and some maths to work out exactly where we want to position the rack, so that we can put that on, trial it, double check in CAD and make sure that we haven't got a horrible bump steer and make sure we've got a reasonable amount of Ackerman. So that's pretty much where we're at on that. Peering through the windows into the paint booth, Gary is getting prepared for the Raptor undercoating on the Redux M3 that we're currently building. That's sort of rewinding slightly. That on Monday of this week was blasted and zinc metal sprayed and epoxy primed on Monday, and then that's now that's right, that was all done on Monday. They've now done the seam sealing and any other prep work that was needed on that, and then that's now in there for Raptor. So yeah, that's moving on as well. There's a lot going on at the moment. And then into the prep bay, which is sort of a bit chaos at the moment because we've been wheeling things in and out of here this morning. But you can now see the results of the Escort wheel arches in one colour, and we're pretty proud of them. I've seen mixed comments in the brief glances I've had on YouTube, but we're really happy with them. We think they look excellent. Obviously, the front wings aren't on at the moment; they're kind of over there somewhere. But we've now got to do what we do is we're going to do the Raptor on the A panel in the inner wing area, and the Raptor on the underside of the outer wings. We've zinc metal sprayed this, again rewinding back to on Tuesday, this was blasted and zinc metal sprayed. We're going to do the Raptor under here, Raptor under the wings, then we'll clean that off where all the spot welds go. Got screw holes to line everything up. We'll realign the front wings, do a full panel up again on the car, and finally check the alignment, and then the wings will be welded on. Once we're happy with all that, which burns a very minimal amount of the Raptor off, which we can then touch up, and it means that the anti-corrosion coating is complete everywhere, where particularly on top of this area where there was rust away, wherever we can't then get at it properly after the wings are on. So that's the reason for why it hasn't got wings on at the moment, yet it seems to be in primer, because it is in primer. We're going to put the wings on after we've wrapped it under them. So yeah, this is blasted, zinc metal sprayed. Really happy with how it's all looking. So yeah, the next stages are get the wings sorted, get the Raptor done on those, then move on to the seam sealing, and keep pushing forward with the body prep work on this. It's all coming together really well now. So I think that pretty much ties up, other than there's a few sort of peripheral jobs going on in the background, like getting ducks in a row for the Allegro project, getting things ready so that we can get things on the jig as soon as we've got the car stripped down. Other than that going on in the background, it's pretty much over to the assembly shop and see how the guys are getting on in there.
Right, welcome back to the assembly shop. This feels weird doing it in reverse order. I'm going to start with the Land Cruiser. The inlet manifold went away to have those tweaks we talked about last week done. That's come back, looks spot on. We've just been working on the oil fill for the cam cover. That was actually the one remaining part of the cam cover we needed to do. And we thought we'll tackle that now so we can send a whole batch of parts for anodising, because the main cam covers are going to need anodising, the inlet manifold and the oil fill. So Adam's been working on the oil fill neck. Scott's just welded that up, that's ready for anodising. James has just machined up a really nice dipstick handle as well, which kind of matches the design of the oil fill cap, because they're going to be next to each other, and that can go for anodising as well. And that's kind of the keystone, if you like, that's been holding up progress. So we're now going to, once those parts are back from anodising, inlet manifold can go on, throttle body can go on, then we can machine the fuel rails, the bracketry for the throttle cable, and that will button up the engine and we'll be into first fire up at that point. So very exciting. E-type, couple of avenues of progress. Adam's been working on some more plumbing, so he's done, I think he'd done the fuel lines down to here last week. We've got a bracket basically there where the hard lines, we've run the fuel line in hard line under the car, where that transitions from hard line to flexi again in the engine bay. We've got the fuel pressure regulator mounted. There's actually surprisingly little space left in the engine bay. By the time you've got all of the tinware in and the engine in, obviously we haven't got that in at the moment, but there's very little free space in here. It's quite nicely packaged originally, so trying to find a space for the fuel pressure regulator where you could actually still access it, neatly run the plumbing, but it wasn't visually in your face was a bit of a juggle. But we've ended up with that down there, so that's protected from the elements on all sides by the panel work that goes in afterwards. Really neat routing of the fuel pipes up from the bulkhead plate that Adam's made down there, where they transition hard line to flexi line, and then that'll be kind of hidden under the throttle bodies here when it's all installed, but still accessible enough to adjust. Brake lines, he's done a hard line that runs from the caliper across to a bulkhead plate, which has actually been removed for Leyland now, but there's a little plate that sits here where there's a bulkhead transition with a little ATEC 90-degree elbow, which then transitions to the flexi line, which goes across to the chassis. So that's all looking neat. And then we are very shortly going to get the engine. We had the call today to say the gearbox is ready to pick up, so we're going to pick that up in the morning. Hopefully that'll all go together without any hassle, and then pretty much the engine can go in. But with a little bit of forward thinking, we've decided to do a full scan of the engine. Might be generally useful anyway, but it was worth doing that because we're doing a custom alternator mount, and that's one of the things that's on the cards soon. And because we want to make that potentially with some machined parts, it's going to be easier to design those mountings in CAD, and also when the engine's in, it's then going to be very hard to scan the engine to get a clean scan of the area where the alternator is going to go. So we thought we'd scan the engine and the chassis before we fitted the engine, so we could make a start on that alternator bracket design. Our hope is, this is yet to be proved because George is working on it right now, is that we can get the alternator on this side, which is the opposite side to where they normally mount. Now we've got a power steering pump on this side of the engine now, but our hope is to have the aircon compressor above it on this side, because that then keeps all the aircon plumbing over here. So we're hoping to have the alternator mounted on that side, probably as an extension of the engine mount at the bottom, with some kind of tensioner bar at the top. And then we're going to have the complication is probably the belt run, because I can see where the alternator is going to fit potentially. The belt run is going to be very tight on the existing tensioner on the water pump belt, and possibly even on the elbow for the radiator top hose. So we might have to do an idler in there, although we were wondering about also redesigning the tensioner for the water pump belt, because in all honesty, it doesn't seem the highest quality part. It's kind of got quite a lot of play in it, and it doesn't really seem befitting of this car. So we may well redesign the tensioners on both as part of that job. But yeah, looking good. And then next week, hopefully, we will see an engine in here. We're very excited about that. I say that a lot, don't I? I ought to stop. The Morris is over the pit. We're doing final spanner check sheet on this at the minute. So with all the vehicles we build towards the end, or at the end basically, we've got a check sheet where we go through with a specific list of all safety critical fasteners on the car, where they're checked off, paint marked with a colour coded scheme, double checked by a second person and photographed with the paint marks on. So we're just going through that at the minute. We haven't pushed ridiculously urgently with that over the course of the last week, because the weather has been absolutely revolting for the last week, so the chances of me getting out in it to test it have been pretty slim anyway. And then James has been working on the boot panelling, so he's now finished the side panels. They're ABS plastic panels, I think they're 3mm thick. We actually put the upper mountings for these in at the metalwork stage, so it was basically just templating and making those panels. He's formed some sheet steel trim panels down here. That material just suited forming some curves on them quite easily, which form a cover for the solenoid for the boot release. And then I think he's done, but it's not in at the minute, he's done the pattern for the bulkhead board, which will go onto those mounts at the top there, that we put them in at the metalwork stage to basically form the finishing panel there in front of the fuel tank. That'll have a light mounted in it for the boot light. Yeah, other than that, once he's finished that, it's upholstering those panels, carpet in, and then we're good to go. The spare wheel goes in there, which we've had for ages, and that lashes down to some points that are built into the shell there. And that's going to be the final step, really, on that. The other thing he's done is the bump stops on this. I think I talked about the fact that this released nicely off the remote fob and off a button inside last week, but it was a little bit, because the gas struts need to be reasonably firm when they go past this sort of initial point here, but then they almost have more force on them when it gets towards the top. And the bump stops we had were a little bit vicious. It felt a bit scary letting it just come all the way up, so we've got some much softer bump stops on it now, so you're confident for that to just come up under its own power. Camaro. Dash, which actually quite conveniently at the moment is all in situ, so with a view to finishing off all of the heater, aircon, pipework and ducting and demist vents, etc. I wanted to get a full build-up of the dash installed, so we make sure we weren't taking up any space that's used by those components. And then that's with a view to then also positioning the engine management system in there, behind there, and getting all the engine room in. But it is quite cool to see a mock-up of how it's going to look. So we've got that central panel there, which is now silver. That was handmade in steel when we did the metalwork on this quite a while ago now. And Stu did a really cool system on the back of that, where it's got a fabricated piece that goes through an angle to turn the ducts to those two vents 90 degrees. So they come in really tight against the actual heat and AC unit in there. And he did some little metal latches, which were a really cool touch, that latch those vents in, because they're Audi A3 vents. They're not overly conducive because they just kind of wedge into a plastic dash. So they rely on the deformation of the dash to actually attach them in. So on this, Stu made some little wire spring clips that you kind of clip over and they hook onto the barbs that normally push into the dash. Really neat. So we've got that in there temporarily. The slot at the top's for the vintage air controls. A few people commented last week about the fact it looked like a robot face, which we'd all noticed as well. Thankfully, it installs the opposite way to how you think. So when it's actually in situ, it doesn't look like a robot face unless you're upside down. And then the side vents, we handmade some steel pods for those ages ago. They clip in the same method, but we needed an adapter on the back of those to adapt them from their normal square format down to a round shape. So George has just quickly CAD'd up and 3D printed some adapters, which do push on. Now we've actually got a material, and I don't know what it is off the top of my head. I should have asked Nat. We've got a material that we can print in, which is actually flexible, almost like a rubber, which we've used for this reason before. I was just talking a minute ago about the fact the vents are designed to go into a sort of rubber piece that deforms. Well, when we can print in a slightly flexible material, we can actually use that kind of deformation method of engagement. So we've made some adapters that push onto the barbs that would normally hold them into the dash. So that's allowed us to then get all of the duct work in. John's bonded in the demist duct adapters that go from the original Camaro slots down to a round hose, and we've got all the pipe work for that in. And we're also waiting on a rubber hose, a 180-degree rubber hose, to just finish off the heater hot water plumbing. But that's all in now, so we can turn our attention to what else has got to go behind the dash. Now we know what space is taken up by all that stuff. So that is that, and moving on to what Bobby's been up to. Jensen CV8, and we're essentially at the lots of head scratching stage of working out the packaging of everything in front of here. Now, when this was just the engine in we put in last week, you think, oh, there's absolutely acres of space at the front of this. The engine's so far back. I mean, it was great from a performance point of view. The engine's entirely behind the axle line. So it feels like there's tons of space in front, but now we're rapidly populating that. It's actually become quite a challenging packaging exercise. So we talked last week about the fact we've got the radiator, AC condenser and charge cooler radiator all in the front, which take up a reasonable chunk of space. One of the biggest challenges is getting an air filter that's of a big enough size for this power of engine with a decent cold air feed in there, because there's not really room to get it over the top of the radiator and have the air filter in front, and there isn't really a lot of space for the air filter there either. So we wanted to try and come up with a way, ideally, of having the air filter behind the radiator pack but still have a decent cold air feed to it. Now there's a vent in the bonnet, which is convenient, which actually feeds where the pancake filter sits on the standard one of these. So we were trying to come up with a way of using that vent to then have a sealed feed to a decent size air filter in an arrangement that looks really tidy and still fits in there with all of that cooler pack. The fans that are going to go on the back, so we've got 2 really powerful fans on there which have quite a deep motor pack on them, and also have the required length of pipe work in a straight line for the airflow meter to perform as it should. So, but we have come up with a package that's going to work. So Bobby's basically doing a sort of rudimentary mock-up. So all this is just temporary mock-up stuff at the minute, but we've built a sort of box here that the air filter will go into. It'll have a removable lid. It's going to be a K&N cone filter. That will then seal up against a flange on the bottom of the bonnet. Now that will be moulded into the bonnet. So this at the minute is just a buck, if you like, for the final bonnet that will be carbon. We're going to do that in double skin, so the underside is one moulding that's visible weave carbon and the outside is another moulding that will be painted on the outside. But that allows us to actually incorporate that air feed with the spigot that's just mocked up in cardboard at the minute into the inside layer of the bonnet, and then there'll be a seal on that. So when you close the bonnet down, it seals onto this area down here, which actually will be covered with a complete moulded panel, a cover panel that covers all this in. So when you look at the front here, there'll be a sort of sculpted composite panel with the radiator cap coming through it, and then this central oval hole with the K&N filter visible in there, but it'll look really clean. And then we've just got space around that to sneak the intake out of the throttle body down underneath the filter housing, which is the straight length that will give us space for the airflow meter, and then back up and a really tight bend back into this side, which is where the air is actually coming from the air filter. So I think we've cracked the layout, definitely. It's tight, it's tighter than we expected given how much space it looked like there would be. But I think it's going to look pretty spectacular once we've got all of this cowling actually final rather than just a mock-up. And there's a few other things we're thinking about. We were talking the other day about the engine covering. So at the moment the charge cooler unions come out of the front. Now we were talking about changing that for the Cadillac charge cooler cover that has the unions on the back, because we thought it might be neater to run the plumbing out the back, but now we're thinking about having this cover here. We're wondering about having a section that sort of tapers into the shape of the engine, then has a gap to allow for the engine movement, and then an engine cover that comes round and actually comes over this sort of charge cooler spigots here and then mates up, so it almost looks like one cover that flows into the engine, covers all the ugly bit up. You still see the top of the charge cooler. We might even do our own sort of top piece for this, but then the plumbing from the charge cooler can be hidden under that cover and actually come forward and have the pump hidden away as well, which might actually look cleaner because then we don't have to have pipe work at the back. We can probably leave the bulkhead completely clean apart from the refrigerant and heater lines this side. So there's a little bit of sort of thinking on our feet at this stage. But then that's the whole point of the dry build phase, is so we can do all this while the chassis is still bare metal. We haven't taken all the moulds off of these panels for the final carbon panels yet. So we can kind of nail everything at this stage and make sure the layout's going to look attractive but be really functional as well. So I'm excited to see all of this lot take shape in its final guise rather than just mock-up. And sort of move that one step further to the final product. And that's about it for this week. But what I am going to do is start a new little section at the end where we answer questions. We did this a little bit on the autofocus series, but we thought it'd be quite cool to do because we always get loads of questions in the comments and very rarely have the time to go through and kind of respond to anything. So what we thought we'd do is get people to ask questions in the comments, and then if you go through the questions people have asked and like the ones you'd most like to hear us answer, each week we'll perhaps pick the top 2 or 3 most liked comments, or most liked questions should I say, and we'll answer them at the end. So get your questions on there. Next week we'll go through and answer the most popular questions. I'll see you next week.